Right.
Okay, we ready to start then, is it?
Yep.
Okay. I'd just like to acknowledge that the city of Greater Bendigo is on Dja Dja Wurrung and Taungurung country. I would like to acknowledge and extend my appreciation to Dja Dja Wurrung and Taungurung people, the traditional owners of the land we are standing on today. Today we pay our respects to leaders and elders, past, present and future, for they hold the memories and traditions and culture and hopes of the Dja Dja Wurrung and Taungurung people. Okay, I've been abandoned by my colleague, who's just come back from England. So I've got to introduce myself today. Anyway, today I want to talk about a project that we've been doing at La Trobe University for quite a few years now. If I can get the slides to go back. Forwards, is that forwards? Yep. Couple of, I suppose, quite a few years ago before I retired, we got what's called an ARC linkage grant. And it all occurred during the kerfuffle over the, I suppose, bringing a mosque to Bendigo. And we proposed a project with the Catholic Archdiocese, or the diocese here, that we'd look at faith on the Goldfields. And with my colleagues, Jennifer Jones, Tim Jones, Brian Rule, Nadia Rook and Donna Bailey, who's the Sandhurst archivist, we've been looking at various faiths on the Goldfields. It's taken us a long time, but we're getting to the point where our book is almost ready to be sent off to the publishers, and that'll be called Living Together on Upside Down Country, Faith, Spirituality and the Social Cohesion on Victoria's Goldfields since 1851. And you can see it's a joint authored book. It originally started out to be a series of single authored chapters, but as I understand, the university's regulations have changed, and my colleagues who are still stupid enough to be at work don't get recognition unless it's a sort of book, a sort of single book. So it's coming out as a single book. Okay, so my part of this project has been to look at the Catholics and the Irish on the Goldfields, and I might sort of introduce the talk by giving you a bit of family background, because part of this background I came across when I was doing research for this project. I was working away in the Sandhurst Diocesan archives, and I started reading a history of the St. Joseph's in Dedarang. And I'll show you a picture in a sec. And I came across a sort of potted history of my own family. And it sort of was from St. Stephen's Church at Dedarang. And it noted how my grandfather, John Fahey, in the 1930s had left Dedarang, but during the Depression of the 1930s, he came back to Dedarang to work on the church, to keep St. Stephen's in good condition. Now, it then had a sort of potted biography of my father's family, and two people in particular, not my father, stood out in this story of the Fahey family in Dedarang. And the first was my Uncle John, who distinguished himself by becoming a Jesuit priest. And a step down, I shouldn't say that, but my Aunt Eileen had become a presentation nun. The rest of the family were just simply listed as not as important. Anyway, in the early 20th century, my family settled in East Malvern and became part of the local Catholic community in East Malvern. My father attended St. Pack's Jesuit College in East Melbourne, and sort of growing up, sort of memories of my childhood is, I suppose, the most striking memory I've got is on Sunday mornings after family roast, we'd go into the lounge room and we'd be seated down and we'd listen to the dulcet tones of B.A. Santa Maria. But on the mantelpiece above the sort of lounge room fire was a sort of huge picture of the Sacred Heart. And what I've come to realise now is that my family was influenced by the sort of Catholicism that was founded in it, or was sort of given to them by the priests of the Sandhurst Diocese, but it goes back even further than that. It was part of what's been dubbed the devotional revolution. Just a bit of a slide, you can see my shameful sort of use of my own family. You can see my great uncle Hubert James, and you can see my grandfather John here, and our great-grandfather Michael Fahey, and they settled, like so many Irish, they settled in the northeast up in the Kiowa Valley, and there's St Stephen's Church, which in many ways, if you look at the inscription there, it'll say that church was, it gives you the foundation stone, but it says that it was established without debt. And just a final slide of my family. You can see Mary and John. I call myself Fay, but my grandfather John used to always tease us kids by saying we were Faheys. My grandmother looks very benign there, but she wasn't. Okay. I go into anyway. A couple of years ago, I went up to give a talk on a different topic in Wodonga, and I sort of mentioned that I came from the Tawonga, and at the end of the talk, this chap came up to me and said, "You're related to those Fays, are you?" And he proceeded to show me a collection of letters where my great-great-grandmother and great-great-grandfather had run the local school, and they'd run it in such a way that all the locals in the Kiowa Valley decided that they'd rush right to the education department and get rid of these obnoxious Faheys. And so the locals at Tawonga found themselves a piece of land. And unfortunately, my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother bought that piece of land. Anyway, so my talk today is going to be in these parts. I'm going to look at religious changes in Ireland from 1848 to 1878. I'm going to say something about Henry Bacchus and the Bendigo diggings, and a feature of my talk will be to suggest that Bacchus is not really, I don't think, the founder of Catholicism in Bendigo and Northern Victoria. It's Bishops Crane and Revel, who I'll say more about. I'm going to then look at who were the Catholics of Bendigo. Then I'm going to look at the creation of the Sandhurst Diocese. And then I want to sort of take the picture from Bendigo and look at the Northern Plains and the high country of Victoria, where I think the Irish really established a very firm presence. I mean, I've just come back from touring that region, paying my respects to my great-grandmother's grave in the Yakandanda Cemetery. The one thing that strikes you as you go through the Northern Plains and the Northeast is a whole series of Catholic churches, Catholic convents, sorry. You can see, as a kid, I used to go to convents to sort of visit my aunt, so I've probably got bad memories. But there's a whole series of these Catholic buildings that I think tell us something about the strength of the Catholic communities in those areas. So then I want to go and look finally briefly at the achievements of Bishops Crane and Revel. Okay, so To understand Catholicism, I think, in Victoria, and even right up, I suppose, until Vatican II, we've got to sort of look at a thing that's been called the devotional revolution. This was a term coined by an American Irish historian, Emmett Larkin, in 1972. And it's to describe the changes that took place in the Catholic Church in Ireland after the famine. Now, there's been a debate about the validity of this term, and some have suggested that the changes that took place date right back to the Council of Trent. But I think really, most recent scholars of Ireland suggest that in its sort of main features, Emmett's devotional revolution still stands. So to give you some sense of what the devotional revolution was, there's this wonderful book by S.J. Connolly called Priests and People in Pre-Famine Ireland. And he paints a picture of religion where church attendance was low. One of the most common forms of religious practice was to attend patens. Patens is a feast, I suppose, recognising the saint of the parish. But by the early 19th century, patens had become rather boisterous affairs where the Irish peasants would sort of congregate around a holy well or someplace like that and indulge in prayer, but also in having a good time. Wakes were also a popular form of religious practice. Another sort of historian, David Miller, has analysed available statistics, and he's found that mass attendance in the pre-famine years was under 50%, which is quite amazing because by the end of the 19th century and well into the 20th century, attendance at mass in Ireland was almost universal. Larkin also suggested the ratio of priests to people was low, and nuns and brothers had little influence on education. And he also discovered there was a sort of constant stream of invective from bishops in correspondence to Rome about the education and character of the clergy. And they condemned the practice of stations, which I suppose emerged under the sort of British rule of Ireland, where religious services were held in houses. But by the early 19th century, a lot of these stations had been a good excuse for the local parish priest to sort of stay overnight and get a good dose of whiskey. This was all changed by a remarkable Irishman, Cardinal Paul Cullen. Cardinal Paul Cullen was largely responsible for bringing the Irish Catholic Church into line with Rome. Now, like most senior Irish clerics, Paul Cullen was born into a prosperous farming family, and he was educated in Rome from his teenage years. He was fluent in Italian, and he had the ear of the Pope and all the Pope's senior advisors. He becomes the Bishop of Armagh in 1849, and he becomes the Archbishop of Dublin in 1852, and he's Archbishop from 1852 to 1878. Early on in his sort of bishopric in in Dublin, he convenes a synod at Thurles in Tipperary. And basically, this synod changes or attempts to change Irish Catholic practices. So what he does is he encourages church building, and Emmett Larkin himself has done a huge amount of work looking at the number of churches that were built in Ireland in the years after 1850. Attendance at Mass and confession is increased under Cullen's directorship. And a whole series of practices, I suppose we know as sort of the devotional revolution come into being. We get celebration of the Virgin Mary and the Rosary. We get the devotion to the Sacred Heart, hence the picture above my grandmother's lounge room, and we get the encouragement of such things as sodalities. I used to love taking my students to the Bendigo Cathedral because I think in many ways that's a sort of snapshot of the devotional revolution. Crane, who I'm going to talk about in a moment, built a magnificent church in Dublin, and when he was named as the bishop of this new Sandhurst diocese, he'd actually he was in Chicago, where his brother was a bishop, funnily enough, and I'll come back to that, drumming up money to pay for this church in Dublin. So building the Bendigo Cathedral, in a sense, is continuing that policy of church building that took place in Ireland after 1848. The sort of, I suppose there can be a debate about does Cullen impose this sort of devotional revolution on the Irish people, or do they willingly accept it? And I think in many ways, what Cullen is trying to do has a very, very sort of receptive audience among the emerging group, and I'll say more about it in a sec, of, I suppose, prosperous Irish farmers in the years after the famine. Okay, I want to sort of look now at the role of Henry Bacchus. I've got a few quotes up here, and I think that in many ways they're quite contradictory. John Hussey, who wrote a book on Father Bacchus with not much research, said Bacchus was the only priest in the hectic and turbulent world of Bendigo for almost 20 years. That he was able to save the faith of his people is his greatest achievement. And not only did he save it, he must have nurtured and nourished it well. How else to explain the strong and vigorous tree that has grown from the seed he sowed? Others who have come after him, bishops, priests, and religious, have continued and confirmed his work, but they are the first to admit the strong faith and the vigorous Catholicity that have characterised Bendigo over the years, which is the legacy of Henry Bacchus. He saved money, but he also saved the faith. Now, a sort of quite contrary view comes from another historian of Bacchus, William Dobson, who wrote an unpublished manuscript which is in the Sandhurst diocese. And he says, Bacchus was portrayed in folklore since his death in 1882 as a devout and charitable man. He was, whilst being conscious about his priestly duties, censorious, irascible, and avaricious, a clerical enigma and one of the most colourful personalities of Victoria's golden period. Now, my great friend, Isaac Dyson, who I've lived with for about 40 years, wrote in his diary on the day that Bacchus was leaving Bendigo, breakfast for Dr. Bacchus this morning, leaving Sandhurst after about 26 years residence, Catholic priest who bought up all the corner allotments and choice agricultural land about, is said to have been a friend of the poor. Dyson himself was a very sort of strong Anglican. Okay. We can't deny that there were some great achievements by Bacchus. From 1852 to the early 1870s, with a sort of break of about 4 years between 1863 and 1867, he was the dominant Catholic priest on the Bendigo Goldfield. He was basically the sort of dominant priest because he pushed off anyone else who tried to join him. He was a very successful property speculator, and he left a net estate of about £78,000 or £77,000. By my estimate, that places him in the top 1% of wealth holders in Victoria in the 19th century. He's not as wealthy as some of the great quartz barons of Bendigo, such as Lancel and J.B. Watson, but he really is one of the wealthy men of Victoria. And and he played a very active part in civic life. He was very important in the sort of formation of the Bendigo Hospital, the Bendigo Benevolent Asylum, and he plays a sort of a part in the politics of getting the Coliban water scheme here. And one thing that makes him, in a sense, different from the bishops that followed him, he mixed very easily with the Catholic laity and also with many of the Protestant laity. I mean, he was a friend of Panton, I suppose, one of the police magistrates in Bendigo in the 1850s. And he may have introduced some of his parishioners to land in the Sandhurst district. But I've got this other slide which shows you Bacchus at work. And you can see that I mean, one great thing about Bacchus is his records are beautiful. He's got the most, I suppose, lovely copper plate writing. But you can see that in those years that he's there, as I said, he frightens away or pushes out most other priests who are in Bendigo, and it's he who is responsible for a large number of marriages, baptisms, and burials, all of which bring in money. But, as I said, he was antagonistic to other Catholic clergymen. In the formation of the hospital, he gets engaged in rather vicious sectarian battles with the Presbyterian minister James Nish, and he becomes embroiled in the battle over free, secular and compulsory education, which is sort of interesting. Bishop Gould in Melbourne, when the bill was going to be introduced, Bishop Gould basically tells the priests of Victoria that they have to oppose this act when they give their homilies on a Sunday. And this is one of the first times, I think, that the Bacchus actually gets involved in objection to state education. As an educationist himself, he was, I must say, rather lousy. He didn't spend a great deal of money on education in Bendigo under the denominational system of schools, and the sort of Catholic, Catholic laity in Melbourne had to sort of try and pull him into line to get more money spent on Catholic schools in Bendigo. In 1874, Bacchus, on St. Patrick's Day, foolishly toasted the Pope before the Queen, and this annoyed WDC Denovan, and that, I'm suggesting, wasn't a bad thing. He was a pretty, well, to give you an example, my diarist friend Isaac Dyson, when W.D. Denison went bankrupt, he thought it was great news. But anyway, what Denovan, the Pope, Bacchus toasted the Pope before the Queen, and Denovan was outraged, and he basically said that Mackie, who was a local member who was at that celebration, should have left immediately if he didn't. But then I wonder, was Bacchus in many respects given to a sort of more gentle form of Catholicism that emerged later on? One thing that is very important about Bacchus is he never, ever seems to have objected to mixed marriages, which became a very important thing amongst Catholic bishops after 1872. And I think this is a very wise decision, given that the ratio of, Bendigo had a huge amount of intermarriage between different ethnic groups. And if because of the sort of imbalance of males and females, if Bacchus hadn't have been sort of more lenient on sort of mixed marriages, I think it would have created a great deal of difficulty. I've also got a wonderful diary of a man who grew up in Heathcote. And when Heathcote's going down to Gurgler in 1882, Henry Purcell, who was living in Heathcote, goes down to Melbourne to get a job on the railway. And he comes back after having got a job, and one of the first things he does when he goes to Melbourne is go out to Brighton and visit Dr. Backhouse, who was living there. So I suspect that Dr. Backhouse had a very sort of firm following amongst the Catholics of Bendigo. And his funeral was probably the largest that had been seen in Bendigo to that date, and probably since. But as I'm going to argue in a sec, I don't think he's responsible for developing the form of Catholicism that emerges in Bendigo. Okay. Now, it's been suggested by Kevin Peoples, who wrote a wonderful thesis. Unfortunately, it's never been published, on the churches in Bendigo during the Great War. And Kevin Peoples basically used it as his major source, the Bendigo Advertiser. And the Bendigo Advertiser was owned by the Mackey family, and they were very staunch Presbyterians, and they probably tended on some occasions to emphasize sectarian matters and allow a bit of anti-Catholicism to emerge in their newspaper. But I'm not sure, and the idea that Bendigo is a Protestant city can be to some extent argued by the fact that as Bendigo moves from alluvial mining to deep quartz reefing, we get the migration of a large number of Wesleyans, Bible Christians and primitive Methodists moving into Bendigo. So Bendigo probably has a larger than one would expect Methodist presence in Bendigo, and some of the clerics in the Methodist Church were extremely sectarian, particularly in the late 19th century. But the other thing I think that Kevin missed in his thesis was when he wrote the thesis in the 1970s, he didn't have access to the Bendigo Independent. And the Bendigo Independent was owned by a Catholic family and very much supports a Catholic view of the world from the 1870s through until its demise in about 1918. I've noticed there that the advertisers, say, for example, in 1910 was anti-Labor, where the Bendigo Independent, I always love this, Bendigo Independent was the only daily newspaper in Australia that called for a vote for the Labor Party in 1910. The tragedy was that being good middle-class Catholics, the owners of the Independent split or favoured the yes case in the conscription plebiscites. So I'm not sure that Bendigo is that Protestant city that Kevin Peoples talks about. Okay, let's ask, who were the Catholics of Bendigo? Does Irish equal Catholic? I think the answer is no, and maybe 1 in 4 Irish non-Catholics were non-Catholics, but the Irish were largely Catholic. I think we can identify, I suppose, the largest group of non-Catholic Irish are the Anglicans, followed by the Methodists, and then followed by the Presbyterians. It's interesting that the first Anglican bishop of Bendigo was born in Ireland, and in good Anglican tradition, his brother, who succeeded him as bishop, was also born in Ireland. The first sort of wave of the Irish coming to the Goldfields are often sort of descended from former convicts, and we also get in Bendigo a whole group of what were known as Irish orphans coming. Lord Earl Grey, I think the colonial minister, established a scheme to get Irish orphans away from, female Irish orphans away from the famine and send them out to the colonies. Ireland grows dramatically from the mid-18th century through until the famine. But the famine really stops that growth. The famine itself, starting in 1847 with the disease that kills the potato crop, results in almost 1 million deaths out of a population of 8 million. Quite staggering. I don't think there's a famine in Europe that can match that. But what this does is the famine leads to changes in the agricultural economy of Ireland. They move from cereal production to pasture, and we get the disappearance of the agricultural labourer, and a large part of the population of southern and northern Ireland was small sort of cottiers who basically worked as agricultural labourers, had a sort of small plot of land which they didn't own, on which they grew potatoes to subsidise their income from agricultural labour. But with the famine, this source of income disappears. During the famine, we get an attempt to basically evict these small cottiers from their land, and we get a consolidation of, I suppose, middle-sized to large farms. And it's often argued that this was coming anyway, but the famine just pushes it with a haste. With the disappearance of the labourer and the small farmer, we also get a new form of sort of, I suppose, social life. We get a situation where fathers are unprepared to allow their farms to be subdivided amongst all their sons. And basically what happens is only one son is going to inherit the farm. So if you want to stay on the farm, you have to basically be celibate and wait till your father dies. And in many cases, you have to wait till your mother dies. And you get these great tensions in Irish families between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law. And so Ireland has, I suppose, the lowest marriage rate in Europe, and it has high rates of celibacy, and the population of Ireland collapses. Now, the question is, were the Irish famine victims? Recent scholarship suggests that the Australian Irish were not direct victims of the famine, but products of post-famine economic and social adjustments. They came from across Ireland, with a large concentration from the southwest, most importantly from Clare and Tipperary. And I'll show you a map soon. More women than men arrived, and both genders came out predominantly single. About a quarter of the men came with their families. Now, I think this is very important. All the Irish were British citizens, and they had all the rights of Irish citizens. They could take part in politics, and in Bendigo, they take part in politics I suppose, the first members of Bendigo with manhood suffrage are Irish. They take part in land selection. And I'm not going to have any of this nonsense that Ned Kelly was a poor, benighted Irishman who was downtrodden by the British. He was just a horse thief, probably the worst navy you could ever think of. I should sort of qualify the situation here and suggest that just before she died, one of my aunts, Sister Julian, said that she recalled a time of having a family party up in Toowoomba, where a member of the Kelly family had married into my family. So You can see those. You can see that I've got some bad genes in me somewhere, or there's bad genes in the family. Anyway, gold was the great lure that brought the Irish to Victoria. They come, as I said, after the famines, and they basically come from 1852 in Victoria through to the early 1860s. They go into alluvial mining, especially into puddling. Puddling requires horses. Being rural people, they're very good at controlling horses. But after 1866, the Irish move out of mining and they move into other fields. They tend to live more predominantly on the eastern side of the city, but there's nowhere in Bendigo where the Irish ain't, so to speak. They're spread throughout the city. And unlike the Cornish, they don't form enclaves where they are a majority of the population. And they move from mining into shopkeeping, into hotel keeping. Many of Bacchus's best friends were the prominent, I suppose, hotel keepers of Bendigo. And they also move out of Bendigo and take up occupation in the northern plains of Victoria with the coming of the Selection Acts. Okay. Now, I'm going to argue from here on in that the form of Catholicism that we see in Bendigo for most of the second half of the 19th century, and I suppose up until the Vatican II, is influenced by two remarkable men, Martin Crane and Stephen Revel. They arrive in Bendigo when it's a relatively stable urban community based on quartz reefing, but they also arrive when the Irish are spreading out with free selection into the surrounding countryside and taking up land across Victoria. The great historian of the Irish in Australia notes that the Irish did not dominate any region in Australia, but they went everywhere. And I think Victoria was very kind to them. Now, Crane and Revel stamped on the new diocese, the reforms of Cullen. In 1876, for example, the Sisters of Mercy come to Bendigo. In 1893, the Morris brothers established a secondary school. Crane and I've got there's a misspread there. I've got two Cranes. That should be Steve and Revel. Crane and Revel are. I mean, it's interesting to note, as an American historian has looked at Catholic bishops across the Anglophone world, and Archbishop Cardinal Paul Cullen had a part in, I suppose, placing his men in almost all the bishoprics across the United States, South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia. And Crane and Revel themselves come from that sort of class that produced bishops. They both come from, I suppose, prosperous Irish farming families who can afford to give them an education. And I think it's interesting that Stephen Revel Crane was educated in Rome, whereas Stephen Revel was educated in Belgium. And I suspect that the coming of the Morris brothers to Bendigo might reflect that Belgian background of Revel. Again, Crane comes to Bendigo in 1875, but sort of early on in his period as bishop, he goes back to Rome, and during a trip to Rome, he goes to London to have his cataracts seen to, which actually renders him blind. And Revel, I think, probably is important for actually managing the Sandhurst diocese, which is an enormous creature, the Sandhurst ice. And it extends from the Loddon River, going across all the counties of northern Victoria, right up into the high country. And you can imagine the difficulty that bishops would have in visiting all the various churches. Under Revel and Crane, we get all the elements of the devotional revolution. They sponsor sodalities and other spiritual forms. They take a hard line on godless education and mixed marriages. If you read Crane's pastoral letters each Easter, those two themes come up, that you've got to get your children educated in Catholic schools and you must avoid mixed marriages. And they find, I think, a ready audience for this in the plains and the high country of northern Victoria. I've just got a quote here from the newspaper. You can see, I think, and even in Bendigo, there's a great deal of, I think, you know, I mean, the sort of the emerging Catholics are prepared to accept quite willingly the devotional revolution. You can see here from the Children of Mary, we beg to accept the accompanying gift as a symbolizing our heartfelt gratitude and undying regard for one whose name will be enshrined in our hearts and who has special claim to our affection, as he is a native of our own dear city, Bendigo, signed on behalf of Sodality, Bridget Colgan, great name that, Bridget Coffey, and Treasurer Mary Ellen Keneally. Okay. Crane and Revel go to work immediately, and between 1875 and 1880, they basically start to rebuild the sort of Catholic infrastructure of the Northern Plains. They introduce, as I said, convents. They introduce 34 schools, and by 1880, 382 pupils are in Catholic schools in Bendigo. So they are, and we'll see some more later on of how they proceed with this. I can't get my page to go. Okay, now I think the devotional revolution also finds a very willing audience in the sort of upwardly mobile Irish who settle the plains and high country of Victoria. And one of the things about the Irish coming to Australia when they do, they come not as famine victims, as I said before, but they come when Ireland is modernising. And I would argue that they bring this modernising ethic to Victoria. They come determined to get hold of land. They come determined to sort of adopt all the modern methods of agriculture. And as I said before, they had all the rights to take up the land, and they do take up the land much more successfully than most other ethnic groups. You can see here that the largest group of farmers in northern Victoria is English, but in proportion to their numbers in the community, the Irish are overrepresented among farmers. And you can also, I've just got a picture here, you can see where Northern Irish farmers come from. You can see that sort of southwest area around there. My own family comes from the border of Galway and Clare, but this area through here, Clare, Tipperary and Limerick is so important. I mean, I think about, you can suggest that almost 40% of the Irish in Victoria come from either Clare or Tipperary. They're from all over, but these southwestern counties predominate. And I think Tipperary is very important, sort of being in the Midlands. It's one of those counties that is leading the process of modernisation. And as I say, I argue that form of modernisation is brought with them. So I think that the sort of message that that Revel and Crane we're trying to sort of propagate is willingly accepted and quite willingly embraced by sort of modernising upwardly mobile Irish Catholics. And just so we don't forget women, you can see that, this looks at mothers who gave birth across the northern plains from the Wimmera right up to almost the high country. And you can see that a high proportion of Irish women marry into farming families. So it's not just a thing that men get on the land, it's women also. And women probably ran farms very often in the late 19th century because most husbands either left their farms I suppose to their wives for their just without any objections, but they also tended to leave their wives in control of their farms during the course of their widows' lives. And what I've got coming up is a picture of one of those Irish settlers, John Sweeney. And you can see he settles in an area called Balcamore. He's a native of Cork. And when he dies in 1906, he leaves an estate of about £2,000. He is a moderately but successful family. And for him, the Catholic Church was extremely important, as you can see from this entry in his diary. He wrote, "We lost our mother on the 5th of April, 1893, after only 3 days of illness. Mother was at Holy Communion on Holy Thursday and then at chapel on Easter Sunday and died next Wednesday night. The priest came here Tuesday morning. Mother was always a great lover of her church, and when we were in Castlemaine, would never miss a Sunday, summer or winter. Out here, of course, there were years we only had chapel once a month, and often less than. But of late years, we have a priest station in Numurkah, and for the last 4 years, we have 2 priests." So I think you can see, as that diary expresses, the Irish took very firmly to that new devotional revolution, became great church attenders. One of the things I love doing is looking at Irish wills. And I suppose a sign of respect for the church is the number of Catholic parish priests who get a bequest to say masses for the repose of the soul of the deceased. Okay, just to finish up, what Crane and Revel do is, I'm suggesting, unlike Bacchus, they are the men that build up Catholic Bendigo and Catholic Northern Victoria. And the situation in 1899 was there are 2 bishops. So Revel, by 1899, is a coadjutor bishop. There are 37 priests across the area, 6 brothers, 87 nuns, 102 churches in 17 districts. So these are great builders. 1 college, 7 boarding schools for girls, 31 primary schools, and 8 superior day schools. 4,500 children in Catholic schools, and 1,000 children educated by the Sisters of Mercy and the Marist Brothers in Bendigo. So I'll conclude with that, and I'm willing to answer any questions. But again, to reiterate what I'm saying is that the devotional revolution is brought to Bendigo. It's put in place by these Irish bishops, Crane and Revel, but I would suggest that it finds a very willing audience amongst the prosperous and not so prosperous Irish of Northern Victoria. And just to finish, we can see what's happened to religion up until the date of the current census. You can see that what's the biggest religion in Bendigo? It's no religion. It's grown dramatically since the 1970s. And I suppose the other thing that the Catholics didn't have to confront was, if you look at the sort of combined, the Methodists, they really suffer badly when we get the collapse of gold mining, and they never sort of recover their numbers and their sort of strength since the 1880s. And you can see, I suppose, the Catholics have become the largest congregation in Greater Bendigo in recent years, and the number of people calling themselves Anglicans has declined significantly from about, I suppose, over 20% to about 10%. So there ends the lesson for today. Any questions? Any questions?
The map you had before of Irish population in Bendigo, was that percentages?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all right. I just wasn't
sure. It's the percentage of Irish in each of those electoral districts. Yeah.
Okay. No worries. Thank you.
And you said that most of the Irish, I think, get to about 10% of an area. I mean, people talk about sort of Irish Town in Bendigo, but it's not really Irish Town. It's
not like Harvington.
not like or even Long Gully. I mean, I've worked. I suspect that if you knocked on a door in Long Gully in 1881, a good chances are you'd hear a Cornish accent. Any other questions? Yes.
Where did Bacchus get his money from? Was there a difference between money that parishioners gave to the church as compared to money given directly to the priests?
Well, see, that's one of the great controversies of the Catholic Church in the 19th century is, should priests acquire their own monies? And there's no doubt, I think there's no doubt that Bacchus believed that the money that came into St Killian's was his, and he then uses that money to buy land at the auction sales that take place. And he had a whole group of men who worked with him. There's a couple of very prominent Irishmen, William Crowley and Heffin, who owned the Shamrock Hotel, and another guy by the name of John Harney, who was a one-time mayor of Bendigo. And I suppose another of his friends is the O'Keeffes, who are sort of contractors around town. And the O'Keeffes, I like the O'Keeffes because they make their money as contractors, which is the thing that Irishmen can do. You can just get a horse and a few labourers and you can sort of cart rubbish around. The O'Keeffes, there's a wonderful description in the Melbourne Advocate, of one of the O'Keeffe daughters joining a convent. It was a convent in Clifton Hill, near the. Abbotsford Convent, yeah. And the O'Keeffes, the O'Keeffes sort of take up the devotional revolution, and again, one of their grandchildren becomes a Jesuit priest and has left one of the great, I suppose, landmarks of Melbourne, the Xavier College Chapel, was built by an O'Keeffe. And again, that's sort of the devotional revolution that's sort of introduced in Bendigo is taken by many families from this region in the country back to the city when they moved there. And I mean, it lasts right up until the, I suppose, up into Vatican II. I must admit, I never joined the Sodality as a young man. Bad creature. Yes.
Where did all the money come from to build all those schools and churches?
Basically, by hard work of parishioners. Now, in the case of Bendigo, just can't think of his name at the moment, but the third Bishop of Bendigo in 1920, when he's opening a church in Kangaroo Flat, says this is possible because of the Bacchus estate. But outside of Bendigo, much of the building is done by the parishioners, and it's done through the contributions of the laity, and it's done, I suppose, through such things as Bingo. Well, not bingo, but St Patrick's Day celebrations, and of course, wherever there's Irish, God help us, there's horse racing. So things like St Patrick's Day, horse racing events. It's a huge amount of money is actually raised through donations from the clergy. It's interesting that what the diocese can't do is it doesn't have the wherewithal to basically get most country kids into Catholic schools. So like in the case of my own family, as I said before, they went to a state school, but in bigger towns they were able to build Catholic primary schools, Catholic convents, and in the case of Bendigo, Maris Brothers College. And it's are there any Catholics in the audience here? No. There's a wonderful document in the Catholic archives, which is the Catholic census, and they took a census of Catholic households from about 1933 through until, I think the last one I've got is 1947, and in 33 almost 90% of known Catholics actually undertook their Easter services. So there is very high attendance. And in the case of Bendigo, almost all the children who we can identify as Catholic were going to Catholic schools. So they were remarkably successful in the urban area. If any of you read Gerard Monane's wonderful book, Tamarisk Row? I think it's the most beautiful evocation of St Killian's parish. It's just a wonderful book. You all should read it. Yes?
You have to be a British citizen to select land.
Yeah,
You
basically.
mentioned that the Irish could because they were British citizens. There was no rule back then. So I could say a German miner.
A German miner had to take out had to be nationalised. Yeah. But
You don't mention that in the early slides actually, that Ireland was under British rule during the famine period.
yeah.
That's not mentioned.
It's it certainly is. Well,
I suppose it's no surprise to me that when Irish came here, they embraced their Catholicism because they couldn't practice it at home.
well, they could by this stage.
Well, not freely.
Oh, very freely. But after the what do you call it? Forgot the name of the acts. By the 1830s, I mean, you've got, who was a great liberator, Daniel O'Connell, who I think one of the great sins committed by George Pell was to remove his statue from the front of St Patrick's Cathedral in Melbourne. But Daniel O'Connell wins emancipation for Catholics, and again, I think part of the success of the Irish might be that one thing that the English believed was, if we're going to sort of tame these wild Irishmen, we've got to educate them. And so there is a system of education that's introduced by the British that I think gives a lot of Irishmen basic literacy, but the English are also responsible again in this process of trying to educate these the Irish. The British introduced a system of universities. So your Irish accent, I don't know if you went to University College at Dublin or University College Galway. I think there's a University College at Cork. They are all introduced by the British. Again, I mean, I'm always proud of my my wife's Anne's great grandfather, because we recently discovered that he died in 1919, and he was the mayor of Sale, and there was an idea that they should paint a portrait of Bernard Killeen for the Irish for the town hall of Sale, but this caused great angst in Sale because Bernard Killeen had been an anti-conscriptionist during the great conscription debates of 1916 and 1917. Now, it's interesting because my family comes to, I suppose, Australia in the 1850s. Bernard Killeen, Anne's grandparents, come in the 1860s, and they're coming at a time, I think, where the Land League is come into being, and there's a sort of, I think, a greater radicalism amongst Irish from that generation. But then again, you know, when I think one of the throughout the later 19th century, we get the arrival of people like Michael Davitt coming to Bendigo, gets his understanding is simply totally wrong. But we have the Redmond brothers coming out. So there is a very strong home rule movement of support, I think, in Australia in the late 19th and early 20th century. Yes?
Charles, I was recently, this last week in Denali, where my great-grandmother came off a boat and from, ironically, Tipperary. And I was looking around the town, and on the way you go through Denali, you go through Tunagalla as well. So there are Catholic there are churches from every denomination of these towns. But it struck me, is this church building, is it also about community and feeling like you're creating civilization in a God-forsaken part of the world where you feel alien, just as much as faith? I'm asking that question because the arguments now about faith in contemporary times is that faith comes from the Indian community first. So I'm just wondering, you know, if it was me, I'd be drawn to a church because of the community. Because I'm the other side of the planet and I'm alone and I'm 18.
Yeah, I mean, I can answer that best from a Methodist point of view. I've got this wonderful diary of a chap called Richard Pope, who's he actually migrates to Australia from Ireland. It's a long story, but he comes to Bendigo during the great mineral boom of 1871, and he does two things when he comes to Bendigo. He first of all goes to his local lodge and registers as a member of the lodge, but on the Sunday he goes to the chapel, and at the chapel he can meet people that are, you know, of his faith, but he's also got that community of the chapel, and at the chapel he can meet mine managers who can give him jobs, and so I think community is very important in church building. The other thing about church building in Australia is that there was an Anglo-Irish governor of New South Wales, Governor Burke, and he basically decides in the 1830s that we're going to do away with glebes and basically give land to all denominations. So in a place like Bendigo, all the various faiths could petition the government to get land to build a church. And I mean, you've only got to read, I mean, you know, we're so non-believers, I suppose, in the 21st century, but sort of religion is so central to the lives of people in the 19th century. You know, when you read diaries, you just see how important faith is to people. And yeah, again, I mean, look at a thing like the Golden Square Church, you know, the Methodist Church there. You know, it could accommodate hundreds of people. And on the Sunday there would have been hundreds of people at maybe 3 services. So yeah, faith is very important in building communities, I think. Yeah. You talked about coming up in a place like, I don't know if you know a place like Devonish in northern Victoria. Again, very Catholic community where, you know, I think you get people working together. I mean, I find it interesting that my grandfather still had, you know, he left Toowoomba to work in Melbourne, but he still maintained that link with the church. You know, he used to ride his bike from Melbourne to the Kiowa Valley, which is, you know, quite a trip. Yes.
Would you mind repeating the name of the book you recommended? Tamarisk
Road.
Road, thank you. Do you know the author?
Yeah, Jared Manane.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, most unappreciated Australian author, except overseas.
Who's the author?
Jared Manane. It's a wonderful book, Tamarisk. I mean, it's I mean, Donna and myself found him living in
Bendigo East.
Bendigo East, yeah. And he's there's a part in the book where he gets lost walking along the Bendigo Creek, and it's just wonderful. And his descriptions of going to mass at St Killian's and talking to people, you know, outside the grounds after mass. It's a wonderful book.
One more question. If anyone's got any. I think we're all good. All right. Thanks, Charles.